Hello, good evening to you. Do you ever get the feeling this government cares more about their globalist friends abroad than you and me in Britain?
You have to choose now between Davos or Westminster.
Davos.
Oh, silly me, we knew that already, of course. That was the Prime Minister last year in a now infamous admission that he'd rather be swanning around with technocrat billionaires at the World Economic Forum than being in his own country. And Rachel Reeves was doing precisely that at Davos this week.
The budget in October was draw a line under the economic and financial mismanagement of the Conservative government. I've now put our public finances in order.
In order? I'm not quite sure everything's quite in order. The economy's tanking, everyone's skint, businesses are cutting thousands of jobs and our quality of lives are getting worse. So what happens just days after the Chancellor's visit to her World Economic Forum chums? Well, right on cue, Reeves says she's up for joining an EU customs deal, the Pan-Euro-Mediterranean Convention, as a way of having closer economic ties with Brussels.
We are absolutely happy to look at these different proposals because we know that the deal that the previous government secured is not working well enough.
And in perhaps one of the biggest examples yet of this Labour government gaslighting the electorate, the Chancellor is now going around blaming Brexit for Britain's flatlining GDP. Absolutely nothing to do with her record tax rises, huge public sector pay cuts, or pay rises rather, or her own doom and gloom rhetoric. And let's ignore the facts that we had the fastest growing economy in the G7 last year before Labour took over. No. It's because the PLEBS, you, voted for independence away from the EU gravy train. Reeves told the Observer newspaper today there are loads of estimates showing the negative impact of Brexit on the UK economy. And she added, what I want to do is get some of that GDP back by having a better trading relationship with the European Union. So there you go, there you have it, black and white from her own mouth. The great Brexit betrayal becomes clearer every day. And while this government is selling us down the river with creepy globalists in Davos, back home in Britain, we're suffering the effects. A family-run bakery in Harrogate announced its closings for good after 119 years in business, after blaming the Chancellor for the final nail in their coffin. Lancaster's bakery blamed the government's hike in employer costs, such as small business rates relief, for the collapse in addition to the spiralling cost of living. So, while Rome burns back home, why is Reeves swanning around Davos anyway? We're told she's there to meet leaders in, quote, the global business community to encourage them to put their money back into the UK and back British business. But let's be clear, she's not even met British farmers that she and her colleagues have so badly thrown under the bus.
People watching you in Davos amongst all these millionaires and you saying, well, I've listened to this community, are wondering why you can't listen to the farmers.
All this points to one clear conclusion, in my mind anyway. It seems Davos man Starmer and Rachel from accounts care more about their billionaire buddies on the world stage than they do about the everyday man and woman and child of this country. And I argue they just don't get Britain. Look what the PM did in the immediate aftermath of Southport. He turned up for 19 seconds, laid some flowers down, and then raced back to Downing Street for a drinks party held for Lovey's celeb Labour donors. What a joke. This week he called Southport one of the most harrowing moments in our country's history. But it seems that Southport wasn't harrowing enough for the Prime Minister to swerve or cancel that pathetic drink ceremony. So I say again, the PM doesn't get Britain. Just look how he chose to celebrate Burns Night in Scotland this week. Look at this picture. Out of all the pictures he could have chosen to show to the public, Keir Starmer chose to share a snap of him with a drag queen in Downing Street. What's a drag queen got to do with Burns Night, or indeed Scotland? And by the way, Downing Street are still refusing to say why America's biggest private landowner, Bill Gates, and the BlackRock CEO, Larry Fink, were doing in Downing Street just days before the budget. The same budget that threatens the very future of British farming. So, does this government care more about their globalist pals than you and me in Britain? I certainly think so, but let's get the thoughts of my panel now. Joining me tonight is former Labour Minister Bill Rammell, political commentator Chloe Dobbs, and the political commentator and podcast host Will Kingston. Good evening to you three. Welcome along. Bill, we'll start with you as the Labour contingent on the panel. Do you get the feeling that Starmer and co have too much attention focused on international affairs, their buddies in Davos, the World Economic Forum agenda?
No, I don't. But I do think Keir's response to that BBC journalist, as she then was, saying, where do you prefer to be, Davos or Westminster? And he chose, I think it's about 18 months ago, he chose Davos, was ill-judged. The reality is...
Why did he say it?
I think it was ill-judged. I think the reality is that any government needs to engage with international finance and international businesses, and every government since the year dot has been present at Davos. So it's the right thing to do, but it's about delivering the British national interest. And, you know, you talk about the economy. There are indicators pointing in different directions at the moment. Just 10 days ago, we had the FTSE 100 go through the roof. The IMF upgraded the growth forecasts for the UK.
Yeah, but sorry to say, can I just interject? Trump's taken office again, and the S&P 500's soaring, Nasdaq soaring, and the reason that the FTSE's going up is because the pound's going down. That's why.
Well, the reality is it's going up. That benefits us. And certainly the growth forecasts from the International Monetary Fund are very positive, the strongest in Europe. But we need to deliver on the growth agenda, which is why the announcements around deregulation of planning to make it easier to house build for major infrastructure projects. And I very much welcome as well what looks like being the commitment for a third runway at Heathrow, which can help us to drive growth forward.
All right, maybe even Gatwick as well. Who knows? Will Kingston. Rachel Reeves goes to Davos, rubs shoulders, sipping champers with billionaires, comes back and then days later suggests we're going to be joining this new sort of customs deal with the EU. I mean, what does that say?
Yeah, I'll get to that in a second, Ben, but I just want to cover off the growth thing first, because we keep hearing about the growth agenda from Labor, and every initiative I'm hearing is a government infrastructure project. And I'm not necessarily against property deregulation. In fact, I'm all for that. You know, the third runway is a good initiative. But I think that the delusion that we have is that growth is driven by the government and not driven by the private sector. And my concern is that they just don't really comprehend that. Like, they've had 14 years to come up with a growth strategy, and yet we hear that they are now going to the different regulators across the apparatus of government to try and get ideas. So look, we can talk the customs union. I think that's important to talk about, but I just don't understand how they had 14 years and yet we are still struggling to work out how you grow this economy. And I just don't think it's in the instinct of this government, because their only answer is just to pump more money out the door.
Yeah. Chloe, I should have come to you first. I apologise. Ladies first. I've just realised my gaffe. Nothing intended. Do you think Sir Keir Starmer gets Britain?
I don't think he does. I think that, as you say, he is quite happy to be abroad with technocrats because he's not surrounded by the people of Britain who do not like him. He has awful approval ratings here, so he likes to go and escape and hang out with his friends where he's wined and dined and put out in fancy hotels. And Rachel Reeves at it as well, disappearing off to China when she is in hot water and the markets were in an absolute mess. And I think this idea of doing this trade deal with the EU, this is not a customs union. It potentially might be beneficial, but I don't think that they quite understand when you've got a cabinet full of Remainers why we left the EU. We wanted to get away from all of the technocrats. It's not democratic, but they love hanging out with them. They want to go to the WEF. They want to be in Davos rather than here in Britain.
Chloe, the British public don't agree with you. You look at the polling evidence, there's been a reversal. There's now a steady indicators from the polls, 56 to 44 in favour of rejoining the EU. Now, that's not the government's position. The government respects the results of the referendum, but rightly argues we need a better relationship with Europe. We need a closer working relationship with Europe. And I think this proposal that's come from the EU about us joining the Pan-Euro-Mediterranean Convention, which gives us tariff-free access to European markets. It's much broader than the European Union. It's potentially a good one. Yeah. It doesn't bring back free movement of labour. It doesn't bring back any of the other obligations of the single market. So it's worth doing. So, Bill, why at the same time is Rachel Reeves going around and blaming Brexit for sluggish GDP, when the fact is Labour inherited the fastest-growing economy in the G7? Doesn't the Chancellor not take a second to maybe reflect on their own first 6 months in charge and say, well, you know, markets, I guess, are driven by sentiment. We were so doom and gloom. That speech by Keir Starmer in the Rose Garden, his first ever speech, was one of the most depressing things I'd ever heard in my life. And they wonder why markets tanked and inflation soared and the pound dropped. Does Rachel Reeves not ever
self-reflect and think, well, maybe it's my massive tax rises, maybe it's the splurging in public sector pay rises that is damaging growth?
I think you've got to separate the issues. Brexit has been damaging to the UK economy. You know, there's a whole range of forecasters. The average net cost to the UK each year is about £100 billion. That has been damaging. However...
What about Germany? Germany was in recession last year. They didn't leave the EU.
No, of course, the indicators go up and down. But look, I will acknowledge this. I think the tone from Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer immediately after the general election was too negative. Yes, they needed to explain and justify why the public finances were in the state that they were, but I think it was too negative. That did have some downward pressure on growth. I think that is changing, and the deregulatory agenda that they are putting forward is the clear route forward to get us the growth that we need.
With the exception of property, and we'll see how that plays out, they're not putting forward a deregulatory agenda. They want to regulate football, for heaven's sake. Like, I actually think that this, like, we're hearing deregulation, we're hearing growth, but then the actual actions, and net zero is another very good example, where you're seeing more and more regulation. I think housing is the only area where I've heard anything about deregulation, and that's just because they're going to deregulate in areas that vote Tory anyway, so they're happy to annoy those particular constituents.
Well, Will, you pilloried, going out to the regulators, and it's the regulators that put in place regulations that stymie growth. Rightly, the government is not going out to ask them their view. It's saying we want deregulation proposals. And the fact that Rachel Reeves effectively sacked the chair of the Competition and Markets Authority, because he wasn't embracing that deregulatory agenda, I think is a good indication.
Isn't Will right, though, where he says you've had 14 years to prep yourself, get some ideas together, 6 months in, there's no progress, no growth, and then they're going to the Environment Agency, Ofwat, the CMA, all these bodies for ideas.
We never said growth was going to come within 6 months. The real test of this government will be in 2, 3, 4 years' time, when the impact of what it's doing will, I think, begin to be felt. But, there's a long way to go.
Goodness me. I mean, and then they swan off to Davos, to the World Economic Forum, and Rachel Reeves speaks to some billionaires and whoever else and some globalists, and they come back and she says, well, maybe for growth we need to do some sort of EU deal, customs union.
It looks like they didn't do anything during the 14 years that they were sat on the opposition benches. All this talk of deregulation, AI revolution, OK, great, might be a good idea, but why didn't you think of that when you were on the opposition benches? It's now when suddenly it's all gone wrong that they are just trying to think of any idea they possibly can.
From day one of this Labour government, they were talking about deregulation in terms of planning reform, house building and the rest of it. Okay. But it doesn't happen overnight.
All right.